Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time today to come and see our webinar. We appreciate your attendance. We'll get started in a minute or two, a little bit after the top of the hour. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the 2022 e-commerce landscape explained. Our speakers for today are Christian Münch, Luke Collymore, Jisse Reitsma, Filip Rakowski, and Willem Wigman. My name is Stephanie Matos, and on behalf of Magenta, I would like to thank you all for joining us. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and will be available for viewing no later than the end of this week. Please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box throughout the presentation, as our speakers have saved time at the end to answer them. Any technical questions will be addressed as soon as possible. At this time, I'd like to hand things over to today's speakers. Please take it away.
Hello, welcome. Thanks for joining us on this webinar. We didn't really discuss who was going to take the lead, because this is going to be an interactive discussion between 5 people. Let's dive into our first bit of content. We're going to quickly go through who we are, and then we'll explain what we're going to talk about today. So please, Christian, take it away.
Yes, it's me. I'm Christian. I'm working in Germany for an Adobe solution partner called Nets98. And I'm also an old e-commerce Magento veteran. So maybe you know I'm the maintainer of the command line tool in the image run. And I'm here to represent the point of view of an agency working with Magento, and I'm together with Luke. So Luke.
Thanks, Christian. Hi, I'm Luke Collymore. I'm the Director of Developer Design. So we're an UK-based e-commerce agency and primarily focused on Magento developments. I've been a web developer for around 18 years, and then around 12 years got into some Magento after doing some Virtumart and Red Shop and other sort of Joomla-based e-commerce stores, which was fun. So yeah, representing sort of Magento agency and our experience with Vue Storefront and Hoover, sorry.
Yeah, my name is Jisse Reitsma, and almost when Luke said the name Joomla, it made me shiver. I've done a lot of different things back then with Joomla, but nowadays I'm really purely focused upon Magento and actually Shopware. Doing a lot of different things, but mainly earning a living with training developers, but therefore also agencies. I've been doing a couple of things as an extension developer, also under the hood of XDN. And I've been a Magento Master for a couple of times. I've organized Reacticon and Mage Test as developer conferences in the past. And I'm actually also now hyped up to organize Mage Unconference. And I added a little bit of a mistake to the slides. That's not Mage Unconference Netherlands in 2022, but actually 2023, so next year. It gives me a little bit more time. But yeah, my perspective is mainly that as a teacher, I've been training all kinds of different developers and all kinds of different agencies in, well, all kinds of different technologies. So hopefully I'm able to add something to that situation as well.
Hello, hey. This is Filip Rakowski. I'm co-founder and CTO of Vue Storefront. If you don't know what is Vue Storefront is a headless frontend for e-commerce, and we started with Magento a few years ago. I work with e-commerce technologies since more or less 2015. I was starting with WooCommerce, then moved to Magento, and I was a Magento developer for quite some time. And most of the time, I'm focusing on web performance, actually, how to make it good, how to measure it, and how much hype driven this whole space is. But I think we'll talk about this a little bit today as well.
Oh, okay, my name is Willem Wigman. I invented a new template-based front-end for Magento. And I've been working with Magento since 2011. I'm currently involved in MageOS, where we have a little initiative to try to bring back innovation to Magento open source and have like kind of a playground for developers to bring back some of the developments to Magento features and such. And I'm since recently a board member of the Magento Association, which represents the Magento community and forms a bridge between the community and Adobe. So all in all, I'm a very big Magento enthusiast, yeah, I'm looking very much forward to this webinar today, and to give it a little bit of context, how we came to do this webinar. Filip and I are, you could say, on the opposite side of front-end technologies in e-commerce currently. Filip is one of the founders of View Storefront, which is a headless front end. So that's a single page application and the PWA, and it hooks into composable commerce. And I'm on the other side of the spectrum, working with the Monolith. So that's the one big application. We're going to go into those terms. But my product, Hyvä, works with the Monolith and PHP and multi-page application. So that's kind of the opposite of what View Storefront is. And we came to speak over Twitter in the thread, where we both came to the conclusion that a lot of people are misinformed today on web technologies in the e-commerce space. Terms are being mixed, and a PWA automatically means that it's a single page application, and headless means that you're composable, and a multi-page application can't be a PWA, and it's everything, all the terms are just mixed through each other. And I thought it would be good to explain also from the perspective of agencies, and maybe even more importantly, from the perspective of a merchant, when should you choose for which technology? And if everyone is a little bit more informed on what everything is, then people end up on the right platform. And that should be the end goal, that people end up on the right technology with their e-commerce platform, because then everyone becomes a lot happier. Filip, anything to add to that?
No, I think you've put it perfectly. Like, we just see that there is a lot of hype, there is a lot of buzzwords around headless, composable. A lot of companies and a lot of products actually using all of those terms at the same time because they're popular buzzwords, and we know this is how people do marketing. But at the same time, it could be super confusing to everyone, because if all of those buzzwords are used all together, then a lot of people think that they're actually the same thing. At the same time, we're not really talking that much about the weaknesses of this new technology. So you'll remember we had a lot of ranting about how terrible monoliths are and how great headless is to solve all of the problems, but we never talked about the real issues of headless. So I think it wasn't a very balanced discussion. Right now, we want to have a balanced discussion about this.
Yeah, awesome.
But yeah, the buzzwords maybe go first, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what this webinar will contain, we'll do a bit of buzzwords unraveling. We'll go through some of the most used terms and just quickly describe what they are and maybe what they aren't. And then we skip to, or we move into discussions where we have a couple of topics that we thought of, where we want to have an open discussion between mostly Christian, Luke, and Jisse, because they're maybe a bit less biased than Filip and I are, and to get a perspective from the agency side, where Luke and Christian are doing a lot of sessions with merchants where they advise on whether to use headless or not. And Jisse is involved in so many agencies where he gives trainings, and he knows all of the technologies because he gives trainings in all of the different technologies, that he thought he was a perfect middleman to give us insights on where mistakes are being made, where things work well, and things that he's seen in the wild. And meanwhile, Filip and I are going to try to stay neutral. But I think, yeah, we're in the same mindset. So that makes this a really fun webinar, because we both believe that everyone is best served if we all understand what all of these technologies mean. Then we end with a Q&A session in Zoom, where you currently, if you're watching it live, you're in Zoom and you have access to a Q&A tab where you can ask questions, which we will try to answer as best as we can at the end of the discussion round. So let's dive into some of the technologies and just quickly go through what all of these things mean. So a single page application is a website, or let's keep it to the e-commerce sphere. That would be a web shop that does not refresh the page anytime that you click on a different category or product or whatever. It doesn't fully refresh the page, but it just replaces the parts. Like it loads different categories, so it loads different products, but not the header and the footer, and all of the scripts are not newly fetched from the server. Very often, this is done with a JavaScript framework like React or Vue or Svelte or Angular. There's many of these platforms, but it doesn't necessarily need to be made with a JavaScript framework. And an example there is Hey.com, which is an email platform that basically on the back end, it's a multi-page application or a monolith, but they add a little layer on top of it to just swap items on the page, and they use HTML streaming and a lot of fancy modern browser capabilities, but without building the site entirely with JavaScript. The opposite of a single page application is a traditional website or a multi-page application. And a multi-page application refreshes the whole page anytime you move to a different URL, basically. So when you move to a different page, it fetches style sheets and images and JavaScript, and it reinitializes the page. But the more advanced browsers get, the more technologies you get to get more single page application like transitions and extra capabilities that make the experience of a multi-page application also a lot more fluent and app-like. So these things are constantly evolving and innovating.
Maybe it's nice to make that a little bit more practical, as in maybe most people attending know that Magenta 1, Magenta 2 have always been multi-page applications. While actually with Hufa, from the community of Hufa, there was this element transition API created as an additional thing on top of that multi-page application experience. So yeah, it's nice to just state that this is kind of like what Magento is like for most people. By default,
yeah. So the Luma team or the Madison team, Madison Island team from Magenta 1, those were multi-page application front end, so to say.
Yeah, with but the checkout, for example, Magenta 1 was kind of a single page app, not a pure single page app, but it's different than the other parts of Magenta 1. So you know maybe the concepts.
Yeah, so theoretically, within a multi-page application, you can have one single page that actually it behaves like a single page application again. But I think we're slowly going to drive the newbies here crazy. So
we're only at the second slide, and already we're in the discussion territory.
Or to confuse, you can embed a single page app in a multi-page app.
And the opposite, yeah, I guess.
Yeah. So one of the conclusions from these terminologies is definitely going to be all of these things can be intertwined and mixed through each other. So there's not there's not just one direction or one technology that you need to choose. There's very often an overlap between these technologies, and it's all getting a lot more condensed or closer to each other every year. A PWA is very often confused with a single page application, but a progressive web app, which was a term invented by Google, is a website that's designed to work on any device. And the bare minimum requirements for a PWA is that it has a manifest file which describes your website. So you can store it on any device as a separate application. So you can store it on your desktop or on your phone as a app icon. And you can use features like push notification and such. It's much more focused on hardware capabilities of the device that you're using. So it reduces the layer between the device and the website, like a native application does on a phone, but all from basically using a browser. The three pillars of a progressive web app, as Google coins it, as capable. So it uses capabilities from a device. It's reliable, which means that it should also work on all different network conditions. So if you have a slow network connection, ideally a PWA would still work well. And if you go offline, there's something that works still in your app while you don't have an internet connection. And the last, installable, means that you can install it as an app on your website. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a single page application. You can have, for example, for Luma, the classic Magenta frontend, there are extensions that add a manifest file and a service worker, and then it's a PWA.
Plus, they don't necessarily make Luma suddenly more reliable or installable. So the terminology is also maybe abused a little bit to promote that with a minimum of tools, you can get at least those additional technologies in there, but they don't make it more beneficial to use that technology. Hope I'm making sense, but yeah.
Definitely, and I also heard the definition, and this is also on, I think, official websites of this technology, that they are fast, reliable, and engaging, which more or less boils down to exactly the same things. But from the marketing perspective, it is kind of promising something that is not really delivered by this technology, because it's the same. You can say every application built in Java is fast, reliable, and engaging. Of course, it can be if you build it fast, reliable, and engaging.
Yeah, I think that's been a big topic, a talking point, that PWA has the promise of being performant and fast, but it's till today it's very often under-delivered. Because you can still build a terribly slow website with a PWA. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's fast because it's a PWA. It still requires a lot of specific knowledge to make a PWA fast, just like it's a lot of work to make a classic website fast. The same principles apply.
Maybe it's good to point out also that an SPA and an MPA are often not taken into the vocabulary of some marketeer, but they're just regarded as technical terms. But with the term PWA suddenly, it becomes a buzzword, it becomes a hype, and therefore it's often overpromised, while the final outcome is not more capable or reliable or installable or faster, for that matter. And that's maybe where the difficulty comes in. So there was nothing wrong with SPA or MPA so far, but now there is actually this buzzword that we kind of disagree with.
There wasn't even a term for multi-page application yet until we got a single-page application. So then how we're going to call everything that we used to do before? And the same as with Headless, how we're going to call everything that we did before, like classic websites. Are they non-headless or headful or?
So what does headless mean?
Outdated.
Headless, that's the next term, indeed. So headless means that front-end and back-end of an application are developed separately. So the front-end talks to the back-end remotely, so to say, and they're often based on different technologies. So what you often see is that the front end is built as a JavaScript app, so that's a single page application in most cases, and then it talks with a classic backend or a modern backend, like Commerce Tools, for example, is only a backend with APIs, and you have a headless front end that just talks to that backend, but they're not built into each other, so to say. They're not part of the same application. So for instance, this could be a React or a Vue based front end, a PWA, that connects with Magenta by using GraphQL as a glue to put those two together. Examples of these there's plenty, and we've missed a couple here for sure, but the most well-known ones are a Vue Storefront, Adobe's own PWA Studio, Front Commerce, Daffodil, Graph Commerce, and the list is a lot longer. And that's one of the cool things, that this whole movement of headless commerce did bring a lot of innovation in a very quick speed. But technically, a headless frontend could also be a PHP frontend application. There's examples of Laravel frontends that are built on Magento that just communicate directly with the database with a separate layer, so they don't use the APIs even, and they're quite fast. So also here, there's a lot of overlap between technologies, and if you hear headless, you think of a single page application, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. Did I miss anything here? Okay, cool.
All good.
So a monolithic application is a web application in the traditional sense, how we always used to build it. The backend and the front end are part of the same application. So the UI, the front end, the database access, and the front end, backend are all combined in one application. The Magento is a perfect example of a monolithic application. If you're using it with the standard front end, Luma, or Magento 1, that would have been Madison Island, or with Huva Teams, it would also be in a monolithic approach. So Magenta has been monolithic for years, but it's transitioned to be a hybrid and also be usable as a headless application. The innovation there was heavily pushed by PWA providers like Vue Storefront and Deity and Front Commerce. Those were the head runners, the first ones to build headless applications for Magento. In the beginning on REST APIs, and then Adobe started to develop GraphQL APIs, and now basically all of the headless front ends for Magento are using GraphQL in most cases. And then an interesting thing, a talking point that we'll dive into in a discussion round, a monolithic application could still be composed. Maybe it doesn't follow the ideology of composable commerce, but you can still hook in all of these microservices into a monolithic application and have composable commerce. That's an interesting thing to see what everyone's opinion is on that during the discussion round.
Maybe if I could also point out about the monolith is actually that in the last couple of years, together with that hype on PWA, the monolith as a word also became something that equaled something outdated or old or whatever. And that's maybe one of the main points here to make, that it's not outdated, it's just an application architecture. And if you would choose that application architecture over yet another application architecture because it has benefits, and let's talk about the benefits or the downsides, but then basically there's nothing outdated to it, there's nothing old to it. So I think actually that there's not a hype to promote monoliths at this moment, but there's an anti-hype, or I don't know how to call it, but it's the other side.
Yeah, I think the hype of needing to be headless and composable has cooled down a little bit, and people are trying to now make sense of, okay, so it is cool to go headless and have composable commerce, but does it make sense for my business? And is my company suited to be running a composable technology stack? So maybe let's talk about the opposite of a monolithic application, how many people see it. That's composable commerce. And that's been slowly replacing the hype of PWA, has gradually moved into the hype of composable commerce, which was coined by Gartner, who's very influential in the yearly reporting of upcoming technologies. And they coined the term composable commerce as being the future of business. And you can see in this year's report of the Gartner Magic Quadrant that all of the big e-commerce platforms are following the composable commerce requirements and trying to fit into that box to comply with what Gartner has dictated them. A business approach, so a composable commerce is a business approach that reflects on your IT architecture. So what we're trying to say there is that it's a way that you approach your architecture and that works throughout your whole business, how you approach introducing new technologies and linking different systems together, where you try to make everything as modular and exchangeable as possible. So if you're implementing search, that should be a service that hooks into your architecture and could at some point be replaced by another search provider. Your stock management or your pricing or your product catalog coming from a PIM, all of these things should, in the composable commerce approach, should be interchangeable. Often this means that you're going headless, but that's not strictly required. Going headless, after all, only means that you're separating your backend and your front end from your application. And this goes one step further. I think as a company, you could go composable and do that throughout your whole business, but just not apply it only on the front end and back end of your e-commerce application. You, I think, would still be composable then. I'm sure we're gonna get back to this in a discussion round.
Well,
yes,
yeah, my personal reaction, and that's maybe also something that I want to ask you guys, with composable commerce, I always get the feeling like that we're talking about something new, but as I see it, Magento is currently already composable, because you just mentioned external PIM systems, you mentioned basically multiple microservices that could be integrated, ERPs, CRMs, image providers for some kind of image handling, the list goes on. Without actually that keyword headless. So I'm not sure if on an agency side, for instance, Christian or Luke, you guys are already selling Magento as being composable commerce, or?
But this is actually one of the discussion points.
All right,
so
cool.
we set up. So stay tuned because we're going to discuss this. But yeah, it's very true. I mean, from my opinion, but no, I'm skipping my opinion. I think it makes sense what Jisse says, and I'll be interested to hear how Christian and Luke approach that as an agency indeed, and I'm sure Filip has ideas too. So we're going to move on to that. We're going to leave the terminology there, so at least now during the discussion, you have bit of a clearer understanding of those technologies, but you probably already sense that there's so much overlap between these terms that yeah, it gets hard to separate what is single page application and what a PWA is. But we're gonna try to stick to the right terminologies during the discussion round. So from here, I'm gonna stop the screen share. So as a viewer, you have a bit more of a sense who's talking, and it becomes more of a discussion. So that's also nicer for me, because now I can actually look at your faces while we're talking.
And likewise for Filip.
Perfect.
Okay. So.
Do you want to go into the first discussion topic, Filip?
Yeah, I think I can. Okay, so maybe let's start with actually outlining the context a little bit. So why we ended up here, and explain this all PWA hype in the Magento space, and actually why we wanted to move from Monolith. So why it all started. So if I remember right, it all started around 2019 or at the end of 18 or start of 19. And it was strongly correlated with actually Google launching the PWA technology, then launching Lighthouse, and generally starting to advocate a lot about the importance of web performance. And at the same time, claiming that PWAs are a solution for these performance issues. So PWAs were usually associated with headless and single-page applications, and you may ask why. And I think mostly because no one really understood the real value, and were promised a cure for all of our problems. So scalability, time to market, performance, and it was just going as a package, like single-page application, headless, PWA, kind of like a fresh start. You're having your old monolith with scalability issues. Right now, it's just your API, and you're focusing on a new channel that is bringing this completely new experience, whether conversion, etc. So, we had a problem, and everyone were a little bit irritated with the problems that they had with their monoliths. At the same time, we had technology that was not yet proven on the market, but had a big tech company talking a lot about how it is solving all of the problems. So as you can guess, everyone followed this narrative, followed this hype, because there was no really a way to validate that. And if Google is saying something, then it must be true, right? This promise of a better world must be true. So everyone started adopting headless commerce. Everyone started adopting PWAs. Not many people really knew like what they're doing or why they're doing this, because they were promised so many perks that it was just obvious that it's worth it, right? So
well,
that's
maybe I want to dive into that, because your story is actually that you guys got started with Vue Storefront, and back at the moment when Vue Storefront came out, it was a PWA. It is a PWA, and you guys believed in it, and you're still believing in it, as in it's a great.
I will get into that. I will get into that, because.
But my point is basically that PWA starts becoming a hype, not because necessarily there's a bunch of marketeers that push that term while they know that there's a lot of downsides to it and whatever. No, actually, it's the enthusiasm of the first developers diving on it that kickstarts the hype. And it doesn't mean that now we say that the PWA hype is over, that the success of PWA is over. So I want to differentiate basically that you guys were responsible for that hype, but that was there was a strong reason, because you guys were the first. You were proving that something could be different.
Okay, maybe I'm putting in a very negative way, but I'm trying to also find a reason why so many people are disappointed about this, because there was a clear problem, there was offered solution, but the solution was explained in a way that was at best a little bit misleading. Because the real problems that we had for monoliths were scalability, but not exactly in a sense of scalability for the users, but scalability of development. The second issue was, at least in the agency that I was working for, were competences. So it was hard to find Magento developers, especially front-end Magento developers. It was hard to scale the teams. Also, imagine that you're having like 3 departments, like BigCommerce, Shopware, Vue Storefront, and right now, if your Vue Storefront department is not going very well, if your Magento department is not going very well, it's not a problem to transition developers to work on Shopware front ends, other front ends. This was a major thing that also hyped the agencies, because there was something for them as well, and it was easier to find those developers. And another thing was that, yes, monoliths were slow, but they were slow because they were made slow. And the solution was to optimize the monolith, not necessarily to cut off from the monolith and just start something new. But this kind of thing and this promise was very tempting, because we were promised that like we had a lot of emotional baggage, we have a lot of code smell and a lot of technological depth in our monolith. Right now, we can just detach from this and start fresh without actually starting completely from scratch. At the same time, a lot of things were also promised to us that, okay, once we do this, we can very easily migrate to other backends, etc. So feature proofness. I think that was the main reason why people were buying into it, because we were basically promised solution to all of our problems. There was no way to really validate that. So people were just going blindly into that. But don't get me wrong, like Headless is a solution to certain problems, but the problem is that we're not explaining how to do this right. We're just saying that this technology can be used to solve this problem, but we're not saying how.
So for Philip, maybe it's interesting to remember the time where Vue storefront started. At this time, Magenta 1 was a system, not Magenta 2, and we had to deal with old JavaScript stuff like prototype and jQuery. And I guess the front-end developers were also pushing the PWAs because they want a change in the stack. And that's also true later on. But at this time, you got a system by Magento, and you have to deal with that, with the stack. And at this time, a headless solution was maybe a way to get rid of the old technology stack. That's
that's actually something I've seen in the wild with agencies myself as well. I've trained agencies that wanted to get started with Vue Storefront 1 for Magenta 1. Then simultaneously, they got started with Vue Storefront 1 for Magenta 2, simply because they were able to migrate a certain customer from Magenta 1 with, I don't know the name of the theme anymore, but the old modern theme or whatever, back towards Magenta 1 plus Vue Storefront, and then migrated into Magenta 2 plus Vue Storefront. And that migration was actually easier for them just to swap over from Magenta 1 to Magenta 2 directly with Luma, for instance.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting.
Something we can...
Yeah, continue, Luke, please.
It's something we can... There's been a lot of investment in the back-end technology on Magento 1. So migrating both the front end and back end at the same time was a big task. So it was considered to use. We didn't go ahead with that. So it's.
And did you guys then really get started with Vue Storefront 1 on Magenta 1?
On Magento 2 was our first implementation. Just because of we was burned with our first Luma build. It was way over budget. It was depressing developers on early Magento 2. So thankfully that's better now, but it was, yeah, Vue Storefront came at a good time to kind of solve a lot of those issues.
I would like actually to remember that you said like you got burned with Magenta 1 or Magenta 2 and Luma, because people also get burned with Adobe PW Studio. People get burned with Vue Storefront 1. People maybe get burned also with Hufa. Well, I actually haven't encountered that variation yet, but getting burned is maybe one of the things that we should discuss later. I'm still really interested, Philip. You mentioned like back then the thing started, but are we talking about that people maybe got disappointed specifically with Vue Storefront 1, or other things that you guys did as well?
I think people were like more disappointed about Headless in general, and it's not only about Vue Storefront, because again, like they were promised something, they were just blindly migrating to Headless, then they migrate to Headless and discover the real drawbacks of this technology, and it turns out it's not for them, right?
Yeah.
That's the issue. And you know, I think it's a common thing, especially in the web development world, that we are very hype driven, and when there is a new technology that is solving problems of the previous technology, we're blindly believing into that technology, blindly buying into those solutions, but not talking that much about the drawbacks. For example, right now in the front-end world, there's a lot of talking about resumability and basically not executing JavaScript on the client side until it's needed, so not hydrating the content. And there's a lot of hype around this. Everyone right now are saying that doing things on the client side was a bad idea, but at that time, everyone were loving this idea because no one was really talking about the drawbacks. And that's, I think, a great example of how actually the hype cycle works. Like when there's a new solution, people are just blindly going there. So there's this peak of the hype cycle, then the validation comes in and there's a disappointment. And then after some time, we're kind of in the middle where we know what are the pros, what are the cons, and we can make educated choices. So I really hope we're at this stage right now.
But basically, you say that it's something we can say about a hype, or maybe we can say that about technology in general, because there was a time that Magenta 1 with Scriptaculous and Prototype was hot. That was the best thing, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the problem, right? I mean, that we are making decisions based on the hype, on the emotions, not on like a real evaluation. We are kind of like, being fooled by psychology, by the social proof and this sort of stuff.
Yeah. So the question then to Christian or Luke, you guys got started with headless technologies. So if I'm correct, Christian, Magenta PW Studio back then. But what did force you into that? Well, that's the wrong pick of words. But what did drive you to make that decision to step away from Monolith into something PWA-like?
We didn't step away, so we do everything. So headless, non-headless, SPAs, and also standard Magenta frontends, and it depends on the demands and requirements of the project. And I think it's really important to talk about the cons as well as the pros, but the marketing teams talk about the pros most of the cases. Yeah, so it's good to connect the marketing people with the tech guys. And
we just found the problem, right? We just found the problem.
It's not a problem. It's really a problem. The marketing people use this keywords because they think about search engine optimization. So they use PWA and headless, commerce and composable, and it's and you find this keywords in the text, which are published by the agencies and other companies, and that's why it's misinterpreted by a lot of people. But
so if you get
the tech people have the responsibility to talk about the cons because they have to implement everything.
So if you get burned with a new technology, is that more also then due to the fact that the marketeers have already sold something and then suddenly the developers are faced with that technologies and maybe the reality that actually that technology doesn't live up to things?
No, I think
are other aspects as well, yeah.
I think it's too easy to blame the marketing people, because we are also responsible to bring in the right content. We have to bring the content for the marketing people, and they can change the text a bit, but we're responsible. And we have to go in a discussion in a requirements engineering phase before we start the project, and to find the right solution for the merchant. And the right solution is not always that what the merchant wants. In our case, the merchants ask us to build a few storefront solution or different solution, and sometimes no one is able to talk to a merchant in a way that he understands that you are against his wish and his it's maybe wrong what the customer wants, and some people don't see that, or don't want to go in a discussion because they want to sell and want to have a new project. So from agency perspective, it's not an easy way to discuss the right stuff with a merchant.
I think
but at the end, sorry, Luke, but if you start a project without a requirements engineering phase, then you pay for that during the project, and then you have a bigger discussion with the merchant. Sorry, Luke.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think developers like shiny new tools, and the kind of the promise, and as Filip said, it's you focus on the benefits, not the potential drawbacks. And I guess you don't know what they are until you're halfway through the project, if it's such a new technology.
Yeah, I think like when you're early adopter, you should always expect that there will be drawbacks and always like double check. Right now, the industry is pretty aware, like what are the drawbacks of headless, what are the drawbacks of the monoliths. And I think at this stage, we can really make an educated, right choices based on the data. But at that time, it was all early adopting of the technology that is not so widely spread. And there are some cases of other early adopters, but in general, I wouldn't do early adopting on, for example, large enterprise projects.
Mm-hmm.
Because there will be probably new ways, right? Like there was Headless, right now there's Composable, there will be dozens of other things, because this is how market works. We have to keep inventing the new things that are solving the current problem, then they are introducing new problems, but the hype cycle has to live.
Well, I'm a little bit biased as an arrogant teacher, because you just said like, you need to make an educated choice, and that's what I do. I educate people to make choices, and I believe that actually a lot of the failures with whatever kind of technologies, but also including the ones that were less favoring, so including Luma with knockout to require, are sometimes failing simply because we don't understand the technology. So there's still really fast sites to be made with the old Luma system as well. It's just that you need to put a lot of work into it. And that's where actually also the newer technology comes in, the shiny things that they're fast right out of the box already. But the more you understand the technology, then at least you can conquer it. So my point maybe is also that it's not necessarily about the technology itself. You can build a fast site with all. It's just that maybe it's really, really hard to do that with some technologies, and maybe it's easier to do that with different technologies. And that's basically the knowledge part that you need to have beforehand.
So we got into this talking point to kind of explain how we got here, that PWA start the whole hype cycle, and I think the target of this discussion topic that we had was to more or less identify what happened where people got disappointed with the monolith and moved to PWA. And on the other hand, what now happened with PWAs where people got disappointed and moved them back to the monolith. I feel it's a too big topic that has too many answers to identify. Maybe we can get into that on some of the next topics, because today saying this is why a monolith doesn't work for this merchant or this agency, or the other way around, this is why Headless, Composable, PWA doesn't work for a merchant or an agency, and they should go back to a monolith or keep using a monolith. I think it all comes down to it depends. And it would be nice to identify some of those points, like what does it depend on? Where have you seen, maybe we can dig up particular examples of where a project went for one route and it turned out that it would have been better to go into another route. But I think that's the next, one of the next topics that we have specified. So maybe we can leave this topic as the backstory, how we ended up here, and then dive into the next topic, which was multi-page application versus single-page application, pros and cons, including performance. Now, today with the solutions that we have, both on the multi-page and the single-page application ends, what are your experiences, maybe Christian and Luc, in how performance varies between multi-page and single-page application, and what's the best that you have seen on both of those platforms, how they perform, and what did that depend on, like catalog size or amount of visitors or special requirements? Maybe start with Christian. How do you today compare, if you're talking about performance in the context of MPA and SPA, how do they compare for you?
Yeah, that's not an easy question. So it's a big topic. So especially my background is more a backend developer background, and I've grown up with traditional applications, so multi-page applications. So I know all this stuff, and there's a lot of experience in the market because we have a long time where we could find good solutions for multi-page applications, and then the single-page application come in. And so if I look on a single-page application, I look from the backend developer perspective on the single-page application, and I see some stuff which I don't like in some single page applications, not in every single page application. And it's, for example, that some front-end developers create a single page application and they create components and they try to encapsulate everything in this component, also the data access layer. And so I see that a lot of components are accessing data. And if you open a single page app, so you see often that a lot of requests are made to an API gateway or something else. And it's not optimized for me because it's very crowded. Yeah, so you see a lot of requests and you can bundle them, and there are also solutions for that, but that's much more complex than in a multi-page application. For me, that's my opinion here.
So in the projects that you've delivered for your customers, were there ideal use cases where you chose for a single page application and it performed really well? And was that a typical kind of store? Is that one with more SKUs than a typical store, or something particular to that architecture that made it work well? Because you're saying basically the performance issue that you see is too many requests for data to a backend, which could be optimized into a single request. So if you follow that best practice, how does it compare then?
Well, I think we should investigate the single page application, because it's not an issue of the single page application, it's an issue in the architecture. So you can also make a single page application less noisy. And maybe a backend developer has a different perspective than the frontend developer. And if they could talk to each other, then you can optimize this single page applications as well. So it's, for me, a different discussion here. Both applications can be performed very well.
Yeah, and I think that's again the downside a little bit. So the difficulty maybe with an SPA and that performance problem that you mentioned about too many AJAX requests is actually that out of the box, if you simply just install such an SPA as a dummy, then actually you're suddenly faced with that performance issue. And in general, if you encounter that performance issue of too many AJAX requests in Vue or React, then the common solution, if I'm correct, then is server-side rendering. And then to get towards server-side rendering, it suddenly really becomes complex, because maybe the out-of-the-box solution is flaky and etc. So it starts kind of like a really nice little fresh application that you can easily move around components with and etc. But then suddenly, only after that introduction, suddenly it becomes really, really hard to tackle that single problem. Too many AJAX requests on the page, moving them suddenly into server-side rendering. While with a multi-page application, it's more upfront. Like, hey, if the performance sucks per page, then it's basically something that you need to manage with other techniques. And if the performance is already okay, then actually, well, you don't need to fix anything. So to me, the final outcome is that the performance could be still the same. It's just that the path to get there is totally different.
So I see, by the way, also other issues in that architecture. So one is I can maybe download the database indirectly, because if a browser connects to an API, then also a different script can connect to the API if it's not secured. And then you can fetch maybe more data than anyone expect.
Well, the funny thing is, like, if I would counteract that again, you can also configure Magento as a monolithic application in such a way that, for instance, certain XML files or PHP files are actually readable. So again, maybe a lot of these downsides are not necessarily related to the technology, but more to the knowledge level of that person applying the technology. But I'm stating something again as a biased teacher, so I would like to see like, hey, but how many times have you encountered a certain issue with for instance a monolithic architecture, and therefore you wanted to switch to the other side, or vice versa?
But it's both. So
Yeah.
if a front-end developer has a different focus, maybe Vue components, React components, and so on, and then I expect from these guys that they also experts in securing the application, and that's not true in most of the cases. There are some examples of super experts, but in general, there's a different focus in the daily business. Yeah. So it's and this single page applications make it's easier in a single page application to make mistakes. Yeah. From my perspective.
I think we've seen examples of people bundling back-end API credentials into the front-end applications, thinking that they're going to be secure. Yeah, so that can happen. So it's definitely an implementation thing.
But I was actually coming to this point, and I think actually this problem was something that happened in Vue Storefront 1 quite a lot. That there was a configuration file for the client side PWA and a configuration file for the API that sits in the middle, a node server, and that people simply just made the mistakes of copying the credentials towards the client side, then realizing, oh, but it doesn't work. Let me copy the same credentials to the API, and then it did work. But I wonder how much of that is related to the technology, because I also see newbies coming to a Magento server, creating a PHP file, renaming it to a php.bug file. There's a funny joke going on with signatures in Twitter names that reflect kind of that thing. And I guess actually that still newbies to a technology that is new to them always make mistakes. So I'm still wondering, like the examples that you mentioned about performance and the examples about security, how much of that is actually related to the technology, or how much is related to your knowledge about the technology?
Yeah.
And it's opinionated, right? But again,
yeah, it's also the question about the team setup. Yeah. If you have a lot of different technologies, then you need a team setup which fits. And if it depends on the people you have. If you have only Magento developers and they dive into Node.js, then they have to learn a little bit more.
Yeah, so actually, you mentioned earlier that in your company, you're doing everything. So you're stating actually that this problem is huge on your side.
It's a problem. So sometimes there are not enough people to start a project. And you have to know what's to do, and then you build a team. But if you don't have the right people, then you have to train them first, and you cannot start the project. Yeah. In our case, we did some trainings, and we started with the first Vue Storefront project, and with a smaller one, and then the bigger one came in. Then we decided to do an additional training.
Yeah. So for me, this actually hooks back to something that Filip mentioned a while back, that actually one of the problems that actually Vue Storefront solved back then was basically that it's hard to find good Magento developers, but it was easier to find good, but at least Vue developers. And actually, if you have a team of only Vue developers and you want to build something with Magento, then my personal recommendation is always forget about Hufa, forget about PWA CDO. You should use Vue Storefront, simply because that knowledge is already in-house. Mm-hmm. But maybe another question then, an open question. How much of the problem of the hype and everything else that we complain about, how much of it is actually related to the hype, or more that we have too much choice? Because nowadays, if you want to be a competitive agency and the customer comes to you and the customer says, give me a Hufa shop, give me a PWA suite studio shop, give me a Luma shop, and etc., then actually you would like to say yes, you would like to get that customer on board, but that requires you to support 4 or 5 different front-end technologies.
I would disagree with that approach. So I think as agency, we should define some technologies and we should focus on that. And in our case, we focused on Vue storefront, and we focused on, we have the knowledge in the standard Magenta frontend, so the knowledge already available. But then we did not choose a second headless solution with one expectation. So there's one missing part in the market for me. Currently, we talk about single page applications and they are very B2C focused, but there's no multi-page application headless solution available for B2B and optimized for the Magento shops. So we decided to build our own to fill the gap in the market. So that's what we did, but we have only this maximum 4 different approaches for our customers, because otherwise it's not possible to be an expert. There are other companies which are expert in different technologies, but if you want to compete with them, it's not possible. You cannot give a developer too much stuff to learn. So on Monday he does Vue storefront, on Tuesday he does the different technology. So it's not possible, and it will be a problem for the people too.
Yeah.
So to get back to the original question, how do we compare multi-page application versus single page application? We're back to it depends. Interesting thing that we heard is training is hard. You need to specialize in multiple systems, and it maybe makes sense to specialize in one headless, one non-headless solution, as Christian's approach is. And I don't know if this necessarily is important for a merchant, but for an agency, it's an important to see what developers you have in-house and what's easy to train and to maintain developer-wise. And if that is JavaScript developers, then it's maybe simpler to build single-page applications and go for a headless route. And if you have traditional developers and PHP developers, it's easier, at least, to keep doing multi-page application systems.
And one addition, so sometimes we have the case that the merchant has also a developer team, and we build a bigger team together, and then it's then we have everything multiplied. So you have to train as well the team of the merchant, maybe, and the developers on the merchant side should also be able to work in the technologies. So the decision is not made by the agency. So it's made by the agency and the merchant.
So did we identify a real pro and con in MPA versus SPA, or is it just too hard to say?
Well, so personally, I feel that it's kind of like ridiculous what we then say right now, that basically the choice between MPA and SPA is depending upon knowledge, training, personal preference, the time of day, or whatever. So I don't know whether there's really hard differences where a specific business case always leads into an MPA, or another business case always leads into an SPA.
It's a chicken egg problem.
Yeah. I think we can put that in a context and differentiate SPA and MPA more like headless versus monolith, assuming we are building headless SPA and monolithic MPA. So this is where we can really say about the pros and cons.
Yeah. But I think it's hard to mention really specific features where basically there's no doubt anymore that you should go for a monolith, or where you should go for a headless solution.
Yeah, exactly. Like, the idea behind inventing Ajax applications that then turned out, then turned the name of single page application, what that is just saving the data, and therefore it's being faster, because it's exactly what I mentioned. It's kind of like a hype cycle. So we saw that we are sending a full document every time, and we thought, okay, it would be nice to just update part of the UI if 90% is not changing. So this is exactly what we did. We invented Ajax applications. And I think, when we are talking about SPA versus MPA these days, it's really hard to find the differences, because the current MPAs with the new API additions to the browsers, they're kind of becoming SPAs again. But this problem of sending too much data is still real. So I think, if you have a large HTML files, for example, then it's actually a good use case for single page applications, so you can just update the smaller chunks of data. And I would say in general, like the perfect single page application is faster than perfect multi-page applications, but on average single page application is usually slower than average multi-page application.
I think if you're only looking at the initial page load, then obviously what Lighthouse does tests, and a single page application will never be as fast. But if you consider the whole user journey, like in a conversion, so if a user hits 9 pages between landing on the site and converting, the performance benefit from a single page application, it really benefits on those 8 additional page requests.
Exactly. So if you have a one-page application, for example, then probably a multi-page application is just a better choice. If you have multiple changing elements, if you have a complex navigation, then single-page application might be a better choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we have about 30 minutes if we stretch it a bit. And we have a lot of topics still open, and we have some interesting things in the Q&A. I think one of the questions in the Q&A comes from Sebastian Trax, who asked, could we get some examples of stores that should use Headless or that would benefit from using a monolith, with a few reasons why, pros and cons. And I'm picking out that one because we have one of our topics that hooks into that, where we thought it would be nice to ask Christian and Luke from an agency owner perspective what the pros and cons of Headless versus Monolith are. And then specifically, have you seen a project where you've chosen a monolithic approach that afterwards you had hoped would have been Headless, or the other way around? Have you seen a migration from Monolith to Headless that you thought, I would have hoped that we would have we didn't do that? So maybe we can try to identify a use case where, let's go first with where you went for a Headless solution and it turned out not to be ideal, and why.
Mm-hmm. So we actually took on the site. It was kind of pre-built and just launched. So the original agency didn't really have enough experienced developers in-house, and then the main developer left. It just left them unable to support the application. So I think it's really important to understand the skill set of the team, make sure that there's enough skills to support a complex single page application or headless site. So the development was a lot slower than the merchant hoped. The budget was not there to continue to add new features. The plans they had for the growth of the site was didn't go to plan because there just was not enough budget and there wasn't enough experienced team members to help push that site forward. So I think that was definitely an example of where a simpler monolith would have been a better choice to really grow the business first, then invest in the new technologies.
Okay, I have also an example of a merchant who started to build an yeah, and second, maybe a brand shop, kind of brand shop, as single page application beside a standard Magento shop, but in the same, communicating with the same Magento instance. But at the end, we spent a lot of effort to make the single page application, but the business case was not so that it's they spent a lot of money, but they did not use the advantages of this headless solution. So the idea was to provide a very special look and feel, but at the end they didn't do that in the planned way, because it costs also a lot of money to provide headless solutions. And so they reduced the amount of work by cutting or closing this headless shop, and they integrated that shop in the standard Magento front and back. So it's more a cost discussion. It's not because the technology was failing.
Maybe I've also got another use case that is kind of interesting. So I worked together with an agency that was rather large, and that the agency basically had different teams for different purposes. So one team was really about the marketing stuff. They wanted to integrate all kinds of different marketing tools on the front end. The other one was basically faced with the challenge, build us a Magento shop. And yet another team was actually involved with only the UI. And actually those UI, the team of UI developers knew React. And they tried to educate actually those people to use Magento Luma, and they failed. Simply because Magento Luma was just totally based upon a different technology. So XML, PHP, whatever. And instead they went the PWA Studio way, because it made more sense to just educate the Magento developers to become more knowledgeable about the GraphQL API and the more React architectural stuff. And in that way, they in the end were able to bind the technology of React and therefore Adobe PWA Studio as a glue kind of between all of the different development teams. Mm-hmm. So on one level, that actually has to do with the topic of micro frontends, as in you've got one front end, but actually you can chop it up in multiple different pieces. But on the other hand, every different piece is picked up upon by a specific team. And if you can then find a common technology, then theoretically, that's kind of like the solution towards going into headless.
Yeah. You need the right pieces in the right place.
Yeah. One question I actually see also is that's actually also a really difficult name to pronounce, Vyacheslav Shmali. What are your opinion about using SPA inside the MPA just for specific functionalities like the checkout or custom page? And actually that's quite a common scenario as well, that you take Magento Luma or Magento Hufa. Am I allowed to say that, Magento Hufa? Just Hufa. And then you insert basically Vue components or React components just to do that stuff. And actually currently Hufa is of course one example for that already, because there's multiple different solutions for the checkout, but one of the solutions is a React-based checkout. But I'm not sure that goes beyond the discussion between MPA and SPA, of course, because then we're mixing in the two in a horrible, or not a horrible, but in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, it's more the question, what's your opinion about building a JavaScript app, a little drop-in app as a component inside your multi-page application, and that could work well. You could consider the checkout to be an app that has pagination between the steps of the checkout and that loads within the multi-page application because it's only loaded on the checkout page. And it's a valid strategy. If I look back at the agency work that I did, the first steps that we did there into working with JavaScript applications to prepare ourselves for starting to use single page applications was to build React apps that were used in Luma-based web stores. And that served as a kind of a starting point to learn React and to build certain functionalities, for example, for product page, a complicated configurator could be built with React. And if that's your first step to prepare yourself for going headless later on, then you could reuse that React code or that Vue code or whatever. That component could be reused in your headless store. And if you're using a non-headless and a headless store on the same installation, so if you have one Magenta backend with a Luma store and a Vue storefront store, you could build one Vue component that's shared between those two front ends. Then you just have one code base that you need to maintain. So yeah, that's an interesting step if you're looking to start and learn React, which maybe makes more sense than just going cold turkey and say, now we're going to do a headless store. Maybe dive into the technology first and get some experience, and either as a merchant or as an agency. Yeah.
So Joshua Hughes is asking, what is the best way to decouple the Magenta frontend framework from underlying technologies like require knockout UI components? So that's more specific to Magenta Luma, but actually introducing Vue and React components could theoretically be one way to get rid of that front-end framework. However, it's not really decoupling, it's just coupling with something else. So it's more that you need to envision like where you want to go to next, because, well, I think actually when you're facing all of the technology, the reason why the technology is there is because a checkout needs to be based upon some part of JavaScript. Theoretically, that's not true, but nowadays we basically say that if you want to get more things done on the front end in certain HTML areas, you need pieces of JavaScript. And then the big question is basically, where are you going to end up with? Is that going to be Vue Storefront or PWA Studio or Hufa or Luma or Shopware?
Yeah, his question can be answered in two ways, because he's asking how to decouple yourselves from those specific front-end technologies.
Yeah.
And I think both Headless and the new storefront that I built both completely remove all of those technologies and replace it with something that's more modern and more enjoyable to work with. So maybe Hufa would be an example where you can stay a little bit closer to the technologies that you already know, because 80% is still PHP and the layout XML that you already know. If you're going to go and build single page applications, then you're gonna have to learn to do JavaScript very well.
Yeah, but you could state basically of Hufa that Hufa is not only about that flexibility that you could theoretically replace Alpine with another thing. It's actually also that, for instance, the card is based upon Alpine, but also based upon Tailwind, therefore PHTML templates and therefore XML layouts. So you're still coupling by choosing some kind of front end. You're always coupling yourself with the technology of that front end. And if you would like to migrate away to another technology, there's always basically the rebinding, the recoupling with that new technology. So I would say that decoupling in IT is pretty hard.
But we should talk about the data communication. Yeah. So
yeah.
One idea is to provide more APIs. So add APIs to your old code, so your legacy code. So add APIs, and then you can use the APIs in a headless application as well in a multi-page application. I know that Hufa is also using GraphQL in the front end to load data, and if everyone provides APIs, then you have the freedom of choice.
Well, and the GraphQL API is, of course, a remote API, an HTTP-based API, but there's also the coding API. So if everyone in the Magenta monoliths with Luma and with Hufa and etc. would be using the same kind of view models, and all of those PHP-written view model classes are cleanly written, then again, that's making it better. Personally, I would simplify all of that by saying if the code becomes more simple, it's easier to migrate it into something else. However, the one thing that we don't like about Luma is that it's outdated. Another thing that we don't like is that it's bad for performance. But yet another one is basically that it's so overly complicated just to accomplish a certain task, that's basically just creating depth, technical depth from the very moment that you're just enabling that team. And that's perhaps also a thing to chase after. So it's not about full decoupling, but it's about decoupling just a little bit to make sure that it's easier to dive into something else.
I'm scrolling through the topics that we had, and if I can, I picked out one that I think is interesting to discuss in the time that we still have. Looking at the time, we have 10 minutes. I mean, we can go over, but it's what people expect us to, the time that they expect us to end. A little bit more on the composable commerce stack. We've asked if we can identify what overhead comes when you start composing your e-commerce stack. Like what's required from you as a company, as a merchant, would be interesting, I think. From what annual revenue or budget would that make sense? Like how big should you be as a merchant, and what kind of developers or specialists do you need in your company to successfully become composable in your business architecture?
Yeah, I think yeah, as I say, Magenta, I think, has definitely been most Magento agencies have been using Magento as a composable platform for a long time. So from years ago, everyone's replacing the built-in review system or replacing the built-in email marketing system. We replace the search in nearly every site we do. With Algolia, we replace the reviews with FIFO or reviews.io. We replace the merchandising. I don't think does it need a certain budget, or does it need a certain size company to compose an e-commerce system? I'm not sure. I think Magenta is a really good base for that. I don't know if that sort of ticks the modern marketing term of composable e-commerce.
Yeah,
I think.
Sorry, I have some additions. So for me, it's there are some parts which are really underestimated if you start a composable project. So one thing is the infrastructure, because with every additional system integrated in the e-commerce platform, then it's not only Magento. Then the complexity is higher, and then you have to deal with that as well in the deployment and in scaling your infrastructure, and to find issues. Where's the issue then? If there are 10 applications communicating, find the issue. Then you need intelligent tracing technologies like distributed tracing or good monitoring, and so it's more complex. And also the release management is for me a very underestimated topic. So it's not easy to deploy them. So what's the version of the platform? And which parts are updated? And then you have maybe a mix of on-premise, on SaaS solutions, and everything communicates. Yeah.
But I would say that definitely composable commerce with Magento is leading into that you need to have a higher budget. But I would also say that part of your story, Christian, is also true for the Monolith as well, because we still need Elasticsearch, we still need all of those other services that we're connecting to. I would say that a Monolith like WooCommerce is much cheaper than a composable version of WooCommerce. But I think actually when it comes to Magento, you need a high budget anyway, because simply you're choosing also Magento for that complexity to connect towards all of those other services.
Yeah, and I think it's exactly the same actually with the composable commerce. Like it's the initial time of investment, the initial time of money is much higher than just than for Monolith, but it pays back at scale. So if you don't have a certain scale, it's probably not worth it, because the initial investment will be so high that probably there will be no return. But if you have a very, very high budget, and if you're spending a lot, if you have complex cases, this is where composable commerce really shines.
But you can also save money in some cases. So we talk all the time about the cons of the headless solutions, but there are all the pros. So for me, a pro is we have a lot of projects with SAP connections, and then they talk with SAP, and why should I move all the stuff over Magento? So I can directly connect to a SAP system. So it's sometimes easier and less complex to include some systems directly in a front-end application.
Or instead of building your own SAP.
Yeah, but it's then easier in the communication process. Otherwise, I use Magento as middleware then. And I don't think it's a good idea to move to a lot of communication stuff over the slow processes.
The big difference might be the traditional way that we now consider composable is what we've been doing all along, like just plug in all the systems to your monolith, and the monolith is responsible to tie it all together and then push that to the front end. And I think in a modern approach, Magento itself is not built as composable, but it is composable in a way that you can plug all these things in. And I think the new composable goes, I think as a starting point, takes a composable platform, which is probably a middleware. And you go to really search for something that is in the first place a middleware that sits between all these systems. And then any part of that system that's hooked into it could potentially be exchanged. So if you tie everything into Magenta as a monolith, it's really hard to migrate to another e-commerce platform because everything that needs to be tied into that other platform, and that's a rebuild. Now the promise of composable is that from the start you build something in a way that it could be switched on and off or exchanged without too much effort. So that's a different philosophy, I think. And if you go for that philosophy and you do your research upfront, what systems are you going to hook into that middleware? First, which middleware do you choose? And then all these microservices. But that means from the start, you're already composing everything and taking one subscription there and one there, and your product data is there, and your pricing is there, and your images come from there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have such a wide landscape that you have no choice than to compose everything. And with a monolith, you start with one complete system and you can exchange some of those services, which I guess would make it.
And also a disadvantage.
Yeah. This is why I mentioned, I think at scale, it really makes sense because like what is the biggest selling point of composable? That instead of choosing like getting most of the features from your e-commerce vendor, which obviously has a trade-offs. Like for example, a CMS might not be the best, or this might be not the best. You're choosing the best of breed technologies. You're choosing a lot of different vendors, but each of them is doing exactly the thing you want, exactly in the way you want, and you're composing it. And
so then, what is the sweet spot that you have identified where a merchant should consider? Like what is all that going to cost, and what annual revenue should you at least have to move into a composable first architecture? Because you mentioned specifically, Filip, like you should be at least this big. Can we attach a number to that, or is that important? When should you definitely not do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say definitely don't do this if you're, below 5 million. But after that, it all really depends because, like when you're choosing, when you just want to sell, you're choosing the cheapest solution. At scale, some certain small bottlenecks are generating so much loss that then you're looking for a more optimal solution. A perfect solution is much harder to build. It costs much more, but in the end, your returns are much bigger. So I think it's all about, you know, how much revenue you're getting from your e-commerce store, and then how much you think you would save by using Composable on the long run. But it should be, honestly, this should be usually done during discovery phase or even before that, not just based on a pure number. Like if you are earning, like, I don't know, if your revenue is 50 million, then it doesn't mean that you should always go for Composable. At the same time, there might be some cases when you are earning this magical 5 million, but still Composable is just a good solution for you because it's solving some other problems. So it's not only about revenue. Of course, like the general rule of thumb and probably the most common use case is that if you have high revenue and you have a high complexity of your store, then it's probably better to go headless and Composable, but it's not always, you know, the case.
What I find still interesting is that we shouldn't forget that Composable is still a buzzword, right? What makes a single commerce shop Composable? Is it one Composable service that you connect to it? Is it two? Is it all of them? And for me, the question mark is still also at that moment when you talk about when is Composable becoming the strategy for a certain amount of time. It also depends upon the merchant or the technology, the developers involved to do that. Simply because I also know developer agencies that build Vue storefront shops for a really low budget, and simply because they get it and they just do the same trick over and over again. So yeah, the difficult thing is, I think, with attaching a hard number to that, is assuming that you also have made Composable commerce a really concrete thing. And it's not concrete, it's just a phrase that we in general just say to identify a certain group of scenarios.
I think the term has been coined by Gartner, and there are some specific requirements, but it's going through the same thing that PWA went through, that it's now a marketing term, and it gets fuzzy, like where's the line when something becomes Composable.
So as Christian actually mentioned to us privately, we are running out of time.
Yeah, it's too much stuff. Maybe we need a second webinar. I have some notes here.
But I think, you know, if you would summarize the key takeaways from this discussion, is that just choosing the technology is super nuanced, and even if you have the same project but you have different developers in the company, you could have a different choice as the one that is benefiting you the most.
Yeah, maybe another takeaway is that because it's so difficult, because buzzwords could just get their own meaning easily, and therefore they're just interpreted in the wrong way. You shouldn't make an emotional decision like Christian mentioned earlier. You should focus upon the facts and forget about the buzzwords. And that's basically to get us rid of the hype and just make the discussion a little bit more realistic again.
Yeah, exactly. Like maybe I will share a very simple, very quick anecdote. In Poland, we have a online fairy. She's doing live streams and she's doing tarot. And she became a celebrity in the IT world. And a lot of IT professionals right now is actually calling to her on the stream, asking for technological choices, like what cloud they should use, etc. And, you know, maybe this is just for fun, but in general, like, when something is complex, our brains are always looking for a simplification, and we are always looking for, you know, the simplest possible solution. And we don't like to dig into details. We don't like to see people as things as complex. This is why we are following buzzwords. This is why we are following hype. But the reality is things are complex. And if you will follow the buzzwords, if you will follow the hype, there is a high risk that you will just make a wrong choice, because there's no like an ultimate solution to all the problems. Every technology has pros and cons. The same way, like, you know, the monolith is not just an outdated technology. It still has its applications. It has some issues with certain things. So we discovered Composable and Headless to compensate that. But this is also introducing different problems. And maybe Monolith is a solution of those problems.
That's a good summarize. And at the end, Magenta drives every solution.
Yeah, it fits all needs. And it's great to see that more and more people start to realize where terms are being used correctly and incorrectly. And even we are being corrected in the Q&A that one of our first slides mixed up headless and single page application, no single page application and PWA, I think. It's fuzzy, but it's good that people get back to basics and understanding that there's still a good use case for monoliths, and Composable and Headless has a great future. And certainly not one of the two is going to win anytime soon. I think they're going to continue to work alongside for a long time. And there will be people that stick purely to Monolith, people will stick purely to Composable, and people will right in the middle and just pick the best of both and create a hybrid between it. And it's all possible. Just make sure that you get the right advice before you get into a project and know what you're getting into. Yeah, well, I feel we can fill another 1.5 hours. But if we still feel the need, once we've cooled down from this, maybe we schedule a second session and we rethink what topics we want to discuss then. So let's round up and invite Jill from the Magenta Association to bring it to a close. And if you've made it till here, thank you for listening to us for so long. And for sure, respond to so this is going to go, you're watching this back on YouTube. If you're watching the recording, please let us know your thoughts and have us start a discussion there as well.
I think actually we locked up the cat, right? Or has something gone wrong at Filip's side?
The cat.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Jill.
She just
All
jumped
right.
off from the table.
At this time, I'd like to give a big thank you to our presenters and to everyone for joining us today. After this session ends, you'll see a survey to complete. We thank you in advance for your thoughtful feedback on your experience today. Thank you again for attending today's program, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.